to you. It's a great read. It's a very important contribution. And as you can see now, I am a great fan, and it's my honor to welcome Andy.
All right, well, let me just begin by saying wow, right? Wow for the introduction, wow for next chapter, right? Very exciting. Wow for this venue. How cool is this? Early literacy in a public library. And also wow to all of you. So many of my mentors and colleagues and friends over the years. It really is an honor to be here. So in academia, we spend a lot of time fussing over the distinction, the gap between what we know and what we do, right? And usually that gap is filled with time, the time it takes to translate advances in basic science into clinical practice and in policy. But every now and then, there's a clinical advance that comes around that's so weird, as Perry would say, so novel, so visionary, that it actually takes a long time for science to begin to understand, demystify, and appreciate it, right? And I would argue that Reach Out and Read is a perfect example of that, because it's only been recently that there have been some advances in basic developmental sciences, things like life course theory, epigenetics, neuroscience, that are allowing us to really understand how positive childhood experiences might become biologically embedded, how two generational efforts that focus in building the dyad, things like Reach Out and Read, the Video Interaction Project, Healthy Steps, home visiting, how they might actually alter developmental outcomes, not just 0 to 3, not just 0 to 18, but really across the life course. And so, where are my slides? There we go. So basically, these advances are allowing us to begin to peer inside that proverbial black box that links childhood experiences, both positive and adverse, with outcomes both positive and adverse down the line. And sort of getting glimpses into what the biological mechanisms are that underlie these well-established associations. But in doing so, these advances are also forcing us to reconsider the early childhood origins for adult manifest disease and wellness, right? And they're actually challenging us not only as pediatricians, family medicine docs, as advocates, early childhood professionals, to get things right the first time. And by things, I mean the relationship, genomic function, brain connectivity, right? Instead of constantly trying to repair, remediate, and fix what seem like intractable problems down the line. Now, as a primary care pediatrician, I will be the first to admit that change is hard. So I have no illusions that translating the science that I'm going to talk about today into clinical practice is going to be easy, but fortunately we have some models, right? Like Reach Out and Read, right? But what I hope to convince you in the next 40 minutes or so is that even though it's going to be a challenge, it's one we can ill afford not to tackle, right? And so to accomplish that lofty objective, I have sort of 3 more distinct learning objectives. The first is to talk about these advances in life course theory, epigenetics, and neuroscience, to describe an eco-biodevelopment model. Because one of the problems, I think, one of the barriers we have is that our whole models of health and wellness don't take into context the dimension of time. Whether it's biomedical, biopsychosocial, there's no accounting for what's happened before may impact what's happening now, may impact what's going to happen down the line. And that, of course, has significant implications for practice and policy. And then I'm going to try and define relational health, right? The ability to define or to develop and maintain safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, and at least 3 components of a public health approach to build it. So my concern with trying to accomplish all that, though, is that I'm going to be going from molecular mechanisms all the way up to public policy in a short amount of time. So my fear is that you may feel like you're trying to take a sip from a fire hose, right? So to try and accomplish that, what I thought I'd do is lay out for you a roadmap where we're going right from the start, right? And so I decided to channel my inner David Letterman, right? And come up with a top 10 list, all right? So this is the top 10 list of critical concepts today from the home office, we'll say in Cleveland, Dr. Needleman's backyard, right? So number 1, what happens in childhood does not stay in childhood. Number 9, you cannot define adversity solely on the basis of the event itself. Any objective measure of adversity the only real objective measure is the body's stress response. Childhood experiences change the way your genes work. They change the way your brain forms and functions. And so it's not nature versus nurture, but it's nature dancing with nurture. Safe, stable, nurturing relationships are the antidote to adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress responses, and many of our society's most intractable problems. Promoting safe, stable, nurturing relationships will require a two-generational approach. It's going to require a public health approach, and it's going to require cultural shifts in societal norms and values. That's all, right? Yeah. And I should say after each one of these, again, because I have a short amount of time to talk about all 10 things, so I'm going to have a little blip about each one, and at the end there'll be a little stop sign that comes across. It's a small enough group. If there's something that you're just dying, like I don't get this, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll address it then. Otherwise, we'll try and keep the questions to the end. All right, so the first one, life course science tells us that experiences in childhood, both positive and adverse, are strongly associated with behaviors, health, and productivity decades later. And let me say from the start, these are associations, right? It's not destiny, right? It's not destiny. But whether you're looking at prospective studies, interventional studies like the Perry Preschool Project, Abecedarian Project, the Nurse Family Partnership, or you're looking at retrospective studies like the ACE study and some recent data I'm going to be showing from Dr. Bethel at Hopkins, the timeline's the same, right? The timeline is there's a childhood experience, either positive or negative. There's that proverbial black box, and then there are outcomes. And again, there are strong associations. So if you have significant adversity, we tend to think about catastrophic things like violence, but we know that poverty and adverse childhood experiences are other examples. Those are strongly associated with poor outcomes, academic failure, and economic hardship down the line. But the good news is that early childhood experiences cut both ways, right? Because we know that if you have positive childhood experiences, you have attuned adults like Perry was showing in those pictures where there's shared attunement, and there's opportunities to play and things like reach out and read. Those are strongly associated with healthy lifestyles, academic success, and economic stability. So the trillion-dollar question, it's not the million-dollar question, it's the trillion-dollar question, what's going on inside the box? What are the biological mechanisms that help us understand what's going on here? And it's really important because these are associations. They're not destiny, right? Because we all know kids that have had every possible advantage, yet they do poorly. So we tend to dismiss and say, well, they were just difficult or they were doomed from the start. And then we also know kids that have horrible adversity, yet still do very well and say, well, those kids, they're clearly resilient, right? So we need to get a better idea of what's going on inside the box. All right, stop sign. Any questions about critical concept number one? Perfect, all right. Moving on, critical concept number two, you cannot define or measure adversity or stress on the basis of the events themselves, right? Adversity and stress are extremely subjective. So we sort of know this from our own experience, right? So one child hears a puppy barking, they're like, ooh, puppy, let's play. And another's like, ooh, terrified, right? And some of that has to do with their previous experience and how they interpret and understand the world. But we all know that one man's exciting opportunity is another one's overwhelming, I can't handle it, right? So how do you get the handle on adversity? The other thing is we need to appreciate that adversity actually occurs across a spectrum, right? So we tend to think, again, about the discrete, threatening, catastrophic events, but we also know that there's a spectrum where there's ongoing chronic conditions. And so the two poles here, we would think about abuse and neglect, but between them, there's a whole spectrum of what some people would call the social determinants of health. I actually prefer to think of them as the societal deficiency needs. These are things that kids need that they're just not getting. And the thing they all have in common, of course, is they trigger a physiologic stress response. So this is something we know a lot about. We can measure this. And I think you can appreciate that, the individuals with the highest risk for a toxic stress response, and we'll talk about what toxic stress is in a second, but the numbers with the highest risk are probably the people who experience catastrophic things. We sort of get that. But if you look at the epidemiology, the largest number of individuals that are at risk for toxic stress are actually those that experience neglect, right? Or poverty or racism. And so the other thing you got to take away from this, though, is this whole spectrum, in addition to triggering a stress response, they also all make it more difficult to form those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, right? And that's critically important because we know social isolation is just simply bad for the human condition, right? We are social creatures. And there actually was some amazing work done by Pantel and his colleagues that tried to replicate the ACE study, but not using measures of adversity, but measures of social isolation, guess what? Dose-response curve, right? The more measures of social isolation, the worse you do. All right, so I think that's a stop sign too. Any questions about number 2? You can't define adversity on the basis of the event itself, and there's a spectrum of adversity, right? All right, critical concept number 3. An objective measure, though, of adversity is the body's stress response, right? And the critical concept here, a corollary, is that not all stress is bad stress, right? So Jack Shonkoff and his colleagues came up with a taxonomy of stress looking at the responses. So when people talk about toxic stress, if you can't put the word response behind it, you're probably not using it appropriately, right? Talk about toxic stressors, I don't know what that means, but toxic stress response. So if the response is brief, it's infrequent, it's mild to moderate intensity, then it might be a positive stress response. And it's sort of what kids experience every day in their lives, right? So the 15-month-old who can't express their desires, the 2-year-old who does a face plant while running, right? Beginning childcare, or even the middle schooler who's got that big overwhelming project, doesn't even know where to start, right? The good news is that if you have safe, stable, nurturing relationships there, they can allow that stress response to return to a baseline, right? So we're gonna respond to those nonverbal cues. We're gonna offer consolation to the child who did a face plant. We're gonna reassure that we're going to childcare and that I'm gonna be back at the end of the day. And even for the middle schooler, we're gonna offer planning assistance to break it into little bits so you can handle this, plan it all out, that sort of thing. So the point is, positive stress can actually build motivation, confidence, and resilience in the future. That's critically important because positive stress is not the absence of stress, right? We're not trying to put kids in a bubble, right? We want to give them the skills they need to be resilient. And resilience is a manifestation of skills that can be taught, modeled, nurtured. On the other hand, toxic stress, as you might expect, is the other end of the spectrum, right? Toxic stress responses are longer lasting, they're more frequent or stronger in intensity, and they might be things that you'd expect to happen in response to the adverse childhood experiences. The important point here is there's insufficient social-emotional buffering to turn off that stress response. There's not enough safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And I'm going to use that abbreviation several times. So let me be clear. SSNRs are not the same as SSRIs, right? Very different. If we had more SSNRs, we would need less SSRIs. All right. So because of that chronic exposure to the mediators of the stress response that we can measure that are objective, there are potential for potentially permanent changes through things like epigenetics and brain architecture. All right, any questions about body stress response? That's critical concept number 8. Okay, moving on to number 7. Childhood experiences change the way your genes work, right? So this gets into a whole field. This could be the whole talk today, right, about epigenetics. This is where you're taking a sip from a fire hose, right? So epigenetics means above the genome. It refers to changes in gene expression, but no changes in the DNA sequence. And it's part of a much larger revolution that's happening right now in genomic science, right? Because the old view was that your genome was your destiny. It was static, right? So like the Huntington's, in medicine, Huntington's disease, you get this gene, you know what's gonna happen in your 50s. But the truth is that's the minority of genes. The truth is there's a new view that the genome is actually very plastic. It's sensitive to environmental input. And so the experts say the best way to think about the genome is to picture like a set of switches, very, very complex set of switches. Because like a switch, it's either on or it's off. A gene's either transcribed and expressed or it's not. Some of the genes are master switches, so we know this happens a lot in development. So if you turn on this gene, you get an arm here. You turn on this gene, you get this here, right? We also know that these genes can be very dynamic, so think about circadian rhythms. Some genes will come on and then go off, come on and go off. But the critical point is that some of them are programmed early and very stable across the lifespan, right? And so you may have heard the aphorism, the genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. So not surprising, the American Academy of Pediatrics prefers a less violent metaphor. And so they say epigenetics, not your parents' genome. Right? The idea that just because you inherited the same set of genes as your parents doesn't mean the permutations and combinations are turned on in the same way in the same spots, right? So this is great news, right? Because if you inherit a gene, it makes it very likely that you're gonna be an alcoholic, but the environment never turns that gene on, woohoo, right? This is very empowering, right? But it means we gotta get the environment right. We gotta get the environment right. So I'm about to give an example of epigenetics, but before I do, I have a disclaimer. I want to make it very clear, I am not picking on pregnant women. I'm not picking on pregnant women. But we do know that if there's significant distress in the last trimester of pregnancy, we know that that is associated with methylation of the fetus's glucocorticoid receptor. Why is that a big deal? Well, the methylation tends to decrease the transcription of a specific gene, and so it has been associated with decreased expression of that receptor in the brain. Why is that a problem? Because it turns out that glucocorticoid receptor is what cortisol binds to in a negative feedback loop in the brain. So if you have lots of cortisol, it goes to the brain, it says, we got enough, thank you, time to turn it off. But if you're lacking that receptor, you've sort of released the brake on the stress response. And in fact, if we look at kids that moms have had significant distress in the last trimester of pregnancy, we see that they have reactivity in the HPA axis and higher salivary cortisol levels, which is a really good measure of toxic stress. So the good news is that there's some thought these are actually reversible. There's some preliminary data that suggests that, it's no surprise, touch can actually reverse the methylation patterns, right? But it does point out, if we know this, what are we doing in terms of our public policies? Why don't we have more programs like Centering Pregnancy? Why don't we have more programs like the Legacy for Children at the CDC? Why aren't we giving those sort of extended families to moms and to decrease stress in that last trimester of pregnancy, right? All right, any questions about epigenetics? Good, complicated subject. All right. So, moving on to critical concept number 5, childhood experiences change the way your brain forms and functions. And a really good example of this probably is if you just want to check out Dr. Klass's recent article in the New York Times and Dr. Hutton's recent work, we know that brain architecture is experience dependent, right? So the formation and maintenance of individual connections or synapses, and then the circuits of those connections or pathways, they're dependent upon activity. So that's that if you don't use, if neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So you need to have activity. So we have an example in neuroscience where the ecology influences how the brain architecture is formed initially, but then also how it's remodeled over time, which we refer to as plasticity. The problem is that plasticity is like concrete that's setting. As time goes on, the plasticity gets less, and so that limits our opportunities for remediation. We got to get things right the first time. There also is differential maturation in the brain. I'm not going to go through a whole developmental neuroscience course here, but we'll talk just about 3 structures in a second. But the fact that different structures sort of come online at different times, that combined with some significant adversity can lead to a vicious cycle of toxic stress. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. But the point here is that early experiences create potentially permanent alterations in brain architecture and functioning, and so it's easy to understand how those early experiences can impact behaviors, learning, health outcomes down the line. So again, I'm not going to go into neuroscience too deep, but I really want to talk about just 3 structures, right? So we're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex sits behind your eyes here, and the hippocampus is a little thing in the middle of your brain there. But what they're doing is they both promote reflective adaptive behaviors, right? The problem is they're inhibited by the amygdala. So you got this seesaw, right? On the other hand, the amygdala, that's the part of the brain I think of as the Nike complex. Remember a couple years ago, Nike had a thing, just do it? That's the amygdala, just do it. Just do it, right? It's the part of your brain that's reflexive, it's there to keep you safe. As a consequence, you are more likely to have impulsive and aggressive behaviors. But these 2 systems inhibit each other, right? So in the presence of safe, stable, or I should say in the absence of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, what I think of as being survival mode, right? The amygdala is calling the shots, right? The amygdala is shutting down the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, and we know this from our experience, right? If someone comes up to you, puts a gun to your head, you can't even talk, you're like, right? There's no access to what the options are, right? On the other hand, with the presence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships, when we're in relational mode, right? The prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus shut down the amygdala, and now we have more reflective and adaptive behaviors, right? But here's the kicker. The amygdala appears relatively early. Just by looking at functional MRIs, it appears relatively early, which makes sense, right? If you don't shoot first and ask questions later, there may not be a tomorrow, right? But on the other hand, the prefrontal cortex matures dead last, mid-20s, right? And I should point out, this survival mode versus relational mode, this is a dynamic thing. I'm not saying it's fixed, but the point is, which way the scale is going? Who's calling the shots most of the time, right? So if there is significant stress in childhood, we know because of the differential maturation, because the amygdala, which is sort of the on switch for the stress response, is screaming, right? And the prefrontal cortex is still finding its voice, it's still whispering, right? It's possible in the absence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships for kids to have a stronger stress response. And because of the plasticity in the brain, that can lead to changes in brain architecture. So for example, if you look at the amygdalas of kids that have been raised in Romanian orphanages, their amygdalas are bigger, not too surprising, right? But if you look at the amygdalas of moms who've been depressed, you also see changes, right? So it doesn't have to be catastrophic. But the point is, that can result in sort of a hyper stress response, difficulty coping, and childhood toxic stress. Any questions about neuroscience? Simple, right? All right. So moving on, critical concept number 6, development. And that's first defined. What is development? Development is change over time, right? So our models have to somehow have time. And of course, when you think about development, whether being adaptive or maladaptive, that depends on the context, right? So if you're a neglected child and you start hoarding food, that's an adaptive response. But if now you're placed in a foster family and you're still hoarding food, not taken so well, right? So the point is development, be it adaptive or maladaptive, is a result of an ongoing but cumulative dance between the ecology and your biology. And so this is something the American Academy of Pediatrics endorsed back in 2012 in the toxic stress responses. We really need a new model, an eco-biodevelopmental model, where the ecology literally becomes biologically embedded, and that ongoing but cumulative dance between the biology and the ecology literally drive development outcomes, not just in childhood, but across the lifespan. So we just talked about the ecology, like the physical, nutritional, and most importantly, the psychosocial milieu. Through epigenetics and neuroscience, we know that can become biologically embedded and change literally who you are at the molecular level in terms of which genes get turned on, at the cellular level in terms of the connections you make, and at the behavioral level. And of course, the outcome of all that biology is what? It's behavior, right? But that behavior in turn then changes the environment in terms of what the next experience is. So this ongoing cumulative dance, and that's the thing that this model adds. They're cumulative changes over time at the molecular, cellular, and behavioral levels, and they're either adaptive or maladaptive depending on the context down the line. And those changes are either risks or benefits to health and outcomes down the line. So a couple indications. We need to get the ecology right. We need less ACEs and more positive child experiences, which of course has required dramatic changes in policy and practice. And this is important because it changes how we advocate, because as advocates for kids, we tend to advocate, well, investments in kids and families, well, that's the right thing to do, sort of ethically and morally, it feels good. Or we say, you know, look, there's cold, hard economic data. It's the right thing to do economically. But now we can say, look, investments in kids and their families and their communities is the right thing to do biologically. There's no artificial distinction in this model between mental and physical wellness. We got to end the stigma, right? When kids do poorly, we shouldn't be blaming the kids, right? It's all about context. And many chronic conditions, the so-called non-communicable diseases that are basically bankrupting our health system, those are actually adult manifest diseases with origins in childhood experiences, right? And it allows us to sort of ground vague terms like adversity and resilience in biology. Adversity triggers a stress response, and resilience is the skills to deal with that in a healthy, adaptive manner. Oops. So I love this quote that sort of summarizes this whole critical concept. You know, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower, right? We have to stop blaming children. I would argue we also have to stop blaming their parents. We need to support them. We need to support the parents. All right. Any questions? Good. No time to answer. All right. So if that's the case, then you can argue that safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, these are the antidote for toxic stress responses. And in the past, up until literally just a couple months ago, I would have said that safe, stable, nurturing would have broken that down. I would have compared it to Maslow's hierarchy, right? That if you're having your biological and your safety needs met, that's safety, and if there's connection, that's stable, and if there's a nurturing relationship that builds competence and self-esteem, right? And then I would have linked that to the America's Promise Alliance data, where if you have those 5 promises, kids do well, right? But there's new data out. Yay. And I'm going to go through it relatively quickly, but I wanted to put all the details because I didn't want to get it wrong, right? So Christina Bethel and her colleagues just published this year in Health Affairs. They looked at 51,000 parental reports. That's a lot, big number, right? And they define a child flourishing index, right, which ranges from 0 to 3. And this is a high bar, mind you, for kids to flourish, right? These parents had to report that it's definitely true, right, that their child is curious, completes things, and is in control, right? That's a high bar. And then they looked at Family Resilience and Connection Index, where they said, when your family faces a problem, how often are you likely to talk together about what to do, work together to solve problems, know we have strengths to draw on, stay hopeful in difficult times? And then they also asked their parents how well they can share ideas or talk about things that really matter, again, sort of social support, social capital, and are they handling the day-to-day demands of raising their children? All right, so what do they see? Well, nationally, about 40% of kids are flourishing, right? That means they're curious, they complete tasks, and are in control. And let's be clear, what is that? That's a rough measure of executive function, right? That's prefrontal cortex. That's what we want, right? So, okay. So 40%, well, you know, you say, wow, that's low. Well, I'm not sure I can say my 2 kids could meet that criteria all the time, right? I mean, that's a pretty high bar, right? And there is social bias. Yes, my kids are great, you know, but the point is, they also then looked at this Family Resilience and Connection Index, and not surprisingly, as you have more family resilience and connection, more kids flourish. But this is the kicker. They also looked at ACEs, right? So they looked by ACEs. So this is the take home for me. If you look at kids that have an ACE score of 4 to 9, significant adversity, but they have high family resilience and connection, about 30% of those kids are flourishing. But look at this. No ACEs. Below family resilience and connection, only 26, 27% are flourishing, right? And of course, the kids that do the best, the ones that have both. This, to me, is really important, right? It's really important because it tells us that if we're just looking at adversity and ACEs, we're missing the point, right? All kids need relational health to flourish. And so what I would suggest is that people tend to think about adversity and positive experiences as being 2 poles of the same spectrum. I would say that's not true. I would say that there are 2 different dimensions that kids experience in their lives every day. You can have adversity, but still have relational health, right? And that's important to remember, because we definitely need to do what we can to prevent adversity, but if we are doing a better job of supporting families, all kids across the spectrum of adversity are going to do better, right? All right, so more data. Another report just came out from Bethel, looked at 7 positive childhood experiences. They asked, this is again retrospective, asking parents, if as a child they felt able to talk about their feelings, the family stood by them in difficult times, they participated in community traditions, things like trick or treat and religious holidays, felt a sense of belonging in high school, felt supported by friends, had at least 2 non-parent adults who took an interest in them, felt safe and protected by an adult in their home. And then they also looked at adult depression and poor mental health, and they measured that by either saying you were told by a professional that you had depression, or they were confiding that in the last month, 14 or more days, so more days than not, their mental health was not good, right? So what'd they find? So if you go up the y-axis here, and I should point out, this is not to scale, I apologize, but if you go up the y-axis, this is more depression and poor mental health. And as you can see, as you cross the x-axis, as you have more positive childhood experiences, you have less poor mental health, right? But again, the beauty is they broke it down by ACEs, and you can see that even kids that had significant ACEs, 4 to 8 ACEs, they still did much, much better, almost a third less poor mental health if we have those supports. So what's in the box? I started by saying, what's in the box, right? I would say on the adversity side, there's toxic stress leading to epigenetic modifications, disruption in brain architecture, and behavioral allostasis. And I didn't have a chance to talk about that, but suffice it to say, allostasis is your body's response to come back to normal, right? So, homeostasis is a concept in medicine where we like to be in a certain range. Your sodium can't go too far, bad things happen. And so they're active processes, allostasis, to get it back into that normal range. And so these are behaviors that turn off the stress response. But the problem is, what are those behaviors? Smoking, drinking, promiscuity, substance abuse, overeating, And what are those? Those are the non-communicable diseases that are bankrupting our healthcare system, right? So the point is, on the adverse side, we got toxic stress, but most importantly, on the positive side, we got safe, stable, nurturing relationships that lead to social emotional learning. Strong emotions are okay. It's knowing how to deal with them. I heard this phrase recently that we need to teach kids to embrace the suck, right? It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be scared. There's nothing wrong with the emotion. It's knowing what to do about it, right? And those are things we can model, teach, and learn. And that, of course, will lead to healthy adaptations to stress, right? So when your brother's making you crazy, you can yell and scream and get in trouble, or you can go draw a picture and feel better, and then he gets in trouble, right? You pick. All right. Any questions about that? Right? Okay, so if that's the case, and we're all on board, safe, stable, nurturing relationships, those are the antidote. What are we going to do about it, right? So clearly, relationship implies we need a two-generational approach, right? We need providers to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships. So this is one of my favorite quotes ever from Yuri Brenner, who's one of the co-founders of Head Start, right? And he said, in order to develop normally, a child requires progressively more complex joint activity with one or more adults who have an irrational emotional relationship with the child. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. That's number one, first, last, and always, right? Okay, so clearly, we got to get parents in relational mood, right? So the thing is, that's not an easy thing to do, right? So if parents are in survival mode, right, they haven't had their deficiency needs met, we clearly need to meet them first, right? So now we've got a caregiver who's not in survival mode, who's actually in relational mode. Now we have a chance to build a safe, stable, and nurturing relationship. So now the child is in relational mode. And now we have the opportunity for development of appropriate play, like reach out and read, right? We can actually build foundational skills. And those skills allow the child to realize, hey, this is cool. I can get attention by doing the right thing. I can interact with people. And now we got the parent in relational mode because we got a good attachment going. And we have what I would not call a vicious cycle, but an auspicious cycle, right? An auspicious cycle, but the problem is, what's gonna break that cycle? Unmet deficiency needs, right? Very easily broken. All right, so it sounds simple, right? So all we gotta do is get parents in relational mode, and then we're gonna be able to help them help their kids, right? It's not that simple. So let's think about it. We've got the child, we got the parent, and we got the primary care provider, any healthcare professional for that matter, or even early child education professional, social worker, whatever. The child has a behavior, and we tend to categorize that as either good or bad or helpful or hurtful or age appropriate or not age appropriate. I would argue we have to say, is it adaptive or maladaptive depending on the context? Because it's usually getting something. It's meeting a need. And then we got a parent who's got their own behavior, and the parent's behavior is hopefully going to influence the child in a positive way. And so we talk about parenting styles. We talk about positive parenting, which of course has many different definitions. We could give a whole talk about that. And people talk about serve and return, but I would say, is the parent's behavior promoting a safe, stable, nurturing relationship? If so, then that's our way of trying to promote the child's behavior. And then we got us, right? And we have our own set of behaviors, and you could say we could be authoritarian, you gotta do this. Doesn't work very well, right? You could be indifferent, don't get your shots, I don't care. That doesn't work either, right? And then we can also be authoritative and say, look, this is why, right? So authoritarian versus authoritative, very different, right? But the basis here is we're promoting a caring therapeutic relationship. That is our only leverage to bring about change. And so, of course, then things go the other way. The child's behavior impacts the parent. So we may have temperamental mismatches, right? And of course, the parent's behavior may impact us. We can have potential bias from what we see from the parent, and also secondary vicarious trauma. The takeaway here, though, is, I love this phrase from Teddy Roosevelt, people do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. That has to be the first page in next chapter, right? It has to be the first page. All right, so assuming then that we are gonna develop a two-generational approach, what's the next step? Well, we clearly need to have, as Dr. Klass insinuated, we need a public health approach from practices, because let's face it, there's no magic bullet here, right? Reach out and read, necessary, insufficient, right? We need more. So what would that look like? So this is the public health pyramid, right? We got primary universal preventions for all kids and families, secondary targeted interventions for those that are at risk, And then we have tertiary indicated treatments. And we have some examples here, and I got screwed up there, sorry. But the bottom line is with primary interventions, we have things like positive parenting, play, reach out and read, consistent messaging about what positive parenting is. At the secondary level, we have parental and childhood ACEs, we have the social determinants of health, and I'm really afraid things got screwed up here, and even biomarkers, right? And that's a big thrust right now in the research community. We need biomarkers. We gotta find things that will tell us which kids are risk, so better stratification for who's gonna do poorly. I'm all for that, but if we're not getting the foundation right, we're just chasing our tail, right? And then finally, we have the examples of can't go back here, but examples of tertiary levels, things like attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, parent-child interaction therapy, child-parent psychotherapy. Those are examples of things we can do to sort of approach toxic stress. But if I had to say there's one slide I want you to remember, this is the one, because what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to pivot away from a deficits model, which is toxic stress. And I'm trying to pivot towards a strengths-based model, which is relational health, right? Because if you look at these examples, what do all those examples do? They promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships in a two-generational manner, right? What do all these secondary interventions do? They identify and address potential barriers to safe, stable, nurturing relationships. And what do most of those tertiary things? They repair restrained or compromised relationships, right? So you can almost think about this as be well, stay well, and get well, right? From a relation perspective, right? We gotta be well, we gotta stay well, we gotta get well. So what would this look like then at the provider level, right? Well, in terms of promoting safe, stable, nurturing relationships, we want to build the therapeutic alliance. Again, Teddy Roosevelt, they don't care what you say unless they know you care, right? If you're reading to their kid and engaging with their kid, wow, that guy's got a heart. I like this guy, right? Or gal, right? We're promoting positive parenting, and we're encouraging development of appropriate play. At the secondary level, we're gonna build that therapeutic alliance still. We're gonna surveil for possible barriers to safe, stable, nurturing relationships. And we may champion for screening for barriers at the practice level. And we wanna endorse resources to deal with what we find from those screens. And then in terms of the tertiary level, we wanna build that therapeutic relationship. We wanna employ the common factors approach. We wanna demystify, again, we're not blaming you. There are ways to move forward, being empathic and hopeful. And again, we wanna endorse those referral resources. What about the practice level then? Well, we wanna endorse parenting classes, things like centering parenting and legacy. We wanna participate in Reach Out and Read, the Video Action Project, and other programs like home visiting to support the dyad. We want to do universal screening for the prevalent barriers seen in that particular practice, right? And we want to facilitate, track, and follow up on those referrals offered. And then for a tertiary level, in terms of getting well, we want to try and co-locate counseling services and other services best we can. So we have warm handoffs, and again, we're going to facilitate and track. But the problem is, we can't do this on our own, right? This is much bigger than the family-centered pediatric medical home can do. We also need to have what's called vertical or horizontal integration. So vertical is be well, stay well, get well. Horizontal is we need to go out into the community. So what are some examples that can happen in the community? We can support children and their families through home visiting programs, parks, schools, rec leagues, and we want to really promote social cohesion. At the secondary level, in terms of stay well, we want to identify and address sources of inequity, racism, isolation, and social discord. And at the tertiary level, in terms of get well, we want to embrace restorative justice and social inclusion over punitive measures and exclusion. Again, we can't do this alone. All right, so some of you may be saying, that sounds great, but how are we going to get there, right? We need policy changes that reflect cultural and societal shifts. So what do we do next? If we know that safe, stable, nurturing relationships, they're more likely to occur in safe, stable, nurturing families that live in safe, stable, nurturing communities, right? And so what's that gonna look like? Yeah, I'm gonna go through this quickly, but basically, we need to meet the child's needs. They need to feel connected, and we can use examples like Reach Out and Read in both of those, and we're also going to nurture milestones as they emerge. So you can see how Reach Out and Read meets many of these, right? It's authoritative, not authoritarian. There are ample opportunities to play. Caregivers are engaged in responsive back and forth. There are predictable routines and schedules. We're noting and encouraging milestones as they emerge, and we're giving praise for the effort over the outcome, right? Okay, so that's what can happen in families. What needs to happen in communities? They have to have access to healthy food and safe housing. There have to be efforts to reduce all forms of community violence, and there have to be safe parks and places to play. The housing market's relatively stable. There are access to quality child care centers. The neighbors are engaged and they value community. And they're inclusive faith communities. They're welcoming recreational leagues. They're centers for the arts, because not every kid's good at sports, and their youth have opportunities to contribute. Like, geez, that sounds like nirvana, right? How are we going to get there? There are models out there. So there's a model called Purpose-Built Communities that was started in Atlanta, where they went into a neighborhood basically that had one of the worst graduation rates in the country, and they provided just 3 things: healthcare, housing, and education, along with other things, though. But those were the main things they focused on, and not surprisingly, now they have a 100% graduation rate, right? So we need to meet those societal deficiency needs. But of course, the problem is that our policies reflect cultural norms and values. So what we really need is a cultural awakening, right? All kids are our kids, right? They are a tremendous resource. It's untenable for us to just discard some of them. And if you really believe that, this is a great book by Robert Putnam that lies this out, then all caregivers that come into our offices, they're the aunts and the uncles for all of our kids, right? I heard this phrase recently, fictive kin. Have you ever heard that phrase? I didn't hear it before. Fictive kin, the idea that they're not kin, but they're sort of like kin, right? We need to neutralize the negative archetype of the undeserving poor by revitalizing the American ethos of being good neighbors. Being good. It's not about them, it's about us, right? Policies that reflect that awakening then would embrace this idea of proportionate universalism. This was from the Marmot Report in England, where was basically a public health approach, right? We have some universal goals like wellness, and different people need different levels of intervention to get there. We want to develop policies to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships like family leave, home visiting, Reach Out and Read, the Video Interaction Project. We need to address the social determinants of health and those societal deficiency needs. And we need to encourage things like restorative justice. So we're actually, again, building skills and resilience as opposed to punishment. So some of you may be uncomfortable right now and maybe saying, geez, that's a little too far upstream. Seems like a little too political for me, Doc. I would say that, much like the Academy of Pediatrics has said, supporting kids and families is not a partisan issue. It's a biological issue, and it impacts not only this generation, but the next. But there are others who've been a little more bold. So for example, if you looked at the 19th century anatomist Virchow, he said, politics is nothing else but medicine on a larger scale, which I would argue is actually the 19th century version of, this is our lane. This is biology, right? So what is the next chapter all about? I would say it's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. We need to partner with families and communities to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships, to address barriers to safe, stable, nurturing relationships, and repair strained relationships. Again, this is sort of be well, stay well, get well, and then use those relationships to buffer adversity when it happens, and also build resilience. We can nurture those skills when they happen. So I have no illusion that translating this science into practice is going to be easy. But hopefully I've convinced you it's something we really have to do. And we have some good models out there like Reach Out and Read. But when the going gets tough, let's always remember the words of Frederick Douglass. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Thank you very much. So I don't know, we're doing okay on time?
You've got a few more minutes.
A few more minutes? If there's some simple questions? No, I'm just I never know if that means you understood everything or you're completely confused. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah. always get that question, and I usually push back about the premise because I think we need a public health approach. Oh, yes, repeat the question. I think the gist of the question was, from a policy perspective, if you're going to take one bite, what's the first bite you go for? And I appreciate the intent. What I would say is that, I'll give you an answer in a second, but I would also say that I think we need a public health approach. The idea that we're going to have one magic bullet, I think, isn't really fair. You know what I mean? I think, yeah. Where do you start? Yeah, you can't do it all at once. Yeah, so I think that, I think if we have a focus on, again, from a public health approach, if there was one universal thing I would do, yeah, it would be something along the lines of home visiting or reach out and read. There would be a universal thing that parents in those first couple of months get a support. And I guess the other thing I would say is extended family leave, so we actually have time for those relationships to happen the first year. So I think that would be a universal thing, is how about we work on extended maternity leave and parental leave, so that first year of life we can actually nurture those relationships. In terms of the secondary level, in terms of screening for adversity, I don't think there's any question that, boy, that's a tough call between poverty and racism. Boy, they're both hard, you know what I mean? I think that we have to do a better job of making sure that families have their societal deficiency needs met, so they're in the ability to actually be there for the kids. And we know that when we even just infuse cash infusions into the family, that makes it easier for parents to interact with their kids, and the kids do better. So that would be a sort of a secondary intervention. And then in terms of tertiary interventions, there are models out there, but they're just hard to get into, right? So there are very few parent-child interaction therapists out there. There are very few child-parent psychotherapists out there. So I hope that answers your question. I think that we can do a better job at each of those levels. Yeah.
Andy, thanks for being here. I'm Scott Burns from Connections Children's Health Quality here in Boston, and I'm heading to a summit tomorrow in Cleveland, and the theme is around equity and the 400th anniversary of slavery in this country. And we're doing work with Healthy Start, and one of the things that I'm being reminded of more lately is, you mentioned racism a few times, structural racism, you touched on bias a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to tackle, let's just take equity for a moment, and you finished with public health, then relational health. There are many, and I'm looking at this room, I can't see beyond this phone here, but it doesn't.
You know what?
I don't think it's a very, I don't know how diverse this room is, but the question
Not as diverse as we need it, for sure.
The challenge is, and the question is, how critical do you think in this rubric, and talking about safe, stable, nurturing relationships, it is for our nation to really tackle structural racism? And you know what?
It's fundamental.
I know the answer is yes, but what I'm told is there's no way we're going to address equity unless we tackle structural racism. So could you just reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamental, right? So one example I can give you is, Fliddy and Anda, who did the ACE study. They've both been asked at different times, what they think the toxic milieu in there is, and it's social isolation. That's what I hinted at the beginning, right? It's being excluded and the guilt that goes along with those things, that there's something wrong with me, that I'm not part of the clan, right? So if you look biologically, the thing that triggers the biggest stress response from us actually isn't pain. It's fear of being isolated. It's fear of being the outcast. That is the worst possible thing you can do to a human, but yet we have structural things that are built in to make people feel that way. And so now we have whole neighborhoods that are in survival mode, entire neighborhoods that are in survival mode. So and again, I know it's not a fixed thing. You're not always in survival mode. I mean, but the point is, I think we need to think about it that way. We need to get people out of survival mode into relational mode. And if we can't see each other that way, that's the root of all of this. It sounds simple, but, do unto others, right? I mean, treat people the way you want to be treated. See them as human beings. Don't see them as less than. That sounds so fundamental, but yet it's not. It really is a major issue. But that's the cultural awakening I was talking about. That's a cultural awakening, a pushback in saying, no, when you exclude people, that's bad for everybody. And I don't know how to get at it more than that, right?
How do you think we're doing as a culture, as a nation, in terms of shifting cultural norms around toxic stress and ACEs and SSNRs? I mean, it's amazing to see all the research and even just all the articles in the popular press, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on where we are in terms of shifting cultural norms and what would be some next steps.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a critical point right now. I mean, talk about the tipping point. You know what I mean? I think there has to be an awakening that the way we treat other people says more about us than about them. That's a fundamental change. And that'd be the one thing I could bring to the discussion. That would be it, right? Is that the way you treat other people says more about you, not about them. It's not there's actually, so let me give you an example from cultural media. So have you seen the movie Wonder Woman, right? Yeah, so in Wonder Woman, great movie. I'm not really into violence, but the point is there's a scene there where Wonder Woman has a tank above her head, right? She's about to crush the bad lady who's, been disfigured and is horrible. And the bad guy's like, do it. They don't deserve you, And she says, it's not about deserve. It's about what you believe, right? To me, that was like, that was the take home right there. It's about what you believe. And I think that if we believe what the biology is telling us, when you start excluding people, bad things happen for them and bad things happen for you. I don't know how to put any more than that, but I think we are at a tipping point right now where we're going to say, is it going to be us versus them, or is it going to be we? Yeah.
So we need help in packaging some of this insight for teachers who are really on the front lines every day.
Yeah.
Managing all these issues for these children, and we need help. So any help you have would be.
Well, I think there is a movement afoot, right? So I think there is awareness of trauma-informed services, not only in pediatrics but also in education, trauma-informed education. I think there is an awareness that these social emotional skills that we so desperately need kids to learn can be taught, can be learned, can be modeled. And so there is a movement afoot to have formalized social emotional learning standards. And I'm not getting into debate about testing and that sort of stuff, but I'm just saying that basically, if a kid has trouble in math, we don't say sucks to be you. We train you. We give you additional things. But if you have trouble understanding your emotions, maybe rightfully slow because of what's happened to you in the past, we pretty much say, here's detention, here's your jail cell, that sort of thing, And so I think that would be what I would say, is that an awareness that there are social emotional learning standards and even though education, people say, well, that's not the role of education, it's just cognitive skills, you're not going to make any progress on those other skills unless you address those skills first. And it's not a morals or a value teaching. These are critical skills to be successful in the 21st century.
And I would go so far as to say that the teachers are becoming the fictive family or adult
absolutely.
in children's lives.
Absolutely. But of course, we're in a time where we're actually paying them less and devaluing less, and it's like, oh, yeah.
Are there better ways that communities could organize to support families? And if so, what might be the implications for Reach Out and Read?
Yeah, well, so I think there are models out there where you're looking at like the Harlem Children's Zone, or you're looking at, again, these community-based organizations like purpose-built communities. I think there is a real interest in most big cities. I know in Cleveland at least, there are a number of different pilots out there that are taking different models and saying, what are the levers that we can use to change? Is it just healthcare? Is it just education? Is it housing? Is it poverty? And I suspect it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all thing. You know what I mean? I think it is going to be a type of thing where there has to be, they say, nothing about us without us, right? So it has to be the type of thing where the community is getting involved and the community is saying, these are what we need right now, and meet those needs and build trust and build relationships, right? So that we can move on from there. Yeah, so I think there are some models out there, but I agree with you. It has to be grassroots. It can't be a top-down, we're going to tell you what you need type thing. It has to be a type of thing from the bottom up.
One more question.
Tom DeWitt from Cincinnati. We're going to talk about training later, but my question pulls us back into the primary care setting.
Yeah.
How do we promote and incentivize more addressing these kinds of issues in primary care settings? We do a pretty good job as pediatricians, but there's ways to go. Thoughts about that?
Well, a couple things. So incentivize always sort of implies money. That's a big deal. You know what I mean? And that I think goes back to our advocacy in terms of what is it that pediatrics brings to the table. If you're not thinking developmentally, you say, well, pediatrics is just a little bit of the pie. I don't care about it. That's an afterthought, right? But if you're thinking developmentally, where are the actions at? We got to do a better job. So in terms of incentivizing, in terms of money, that would be the first thing, is education, understanding the science, understanding how what happens in early childhood has huge impacts down the line. I hear there's going to be a panel later, I'm sorry, I have to get back to Cleveland, but about training. I think training is a critical part of it too, right? And I think that actually, this is my bias, but Dr. Klass spoke before about how there's burnout, you know what I mean? I think what we're seeing right now is the burnout actually is sort of a derogatory term because it implies like there's something wrong with us, right?